we've kind of seen this on a national level too, is like the erosion of the middle class, not just at a macroeconomic level, but when you look at these properties, we have seen at times, we've seen the large properties do pretty well, the small properties do pretty well, both from bedrooms and then also rate tiers, like lower end properties are actually doing okay in a lot of markets. High end properties are doing okay. It's that middle that's kind of disappeared. And so maybe these families that would normally book a 4-bedroom property are saying, hey, we've got to save some money. We can squeeze into a 2 or 3 bedroom.
Straight Fire VR investigates the Vanishing Act. Where has the middle market gone, and will it come back? When pricing is priceless to a strategy, acknowledging the missing middle is key to putting together the pricing puzzle. Breaking down the numbers today is an expert in the market. She is the Executive Director of Data Insights at Key Data, Melanie Brown. Alongside in the investigation is the Regional Director of Business Development at V-Trips and co-host of the Straight Fire VR podcast, Miriam Ramsey. Getting to the bottom of the case is the founder and CEO of V-Trips, as well as the host of Straight Fire VR, Steve Milo. Steve, go ahead and open up the case files.
Hey, thank you, Heather. Appreciate it. Glad to have Miriam back with me, and we took a little break during the summer, but I'm glad we did because a lot has happened. So one of the things that's happened is before we took our summer break, we were all excited how June was looking, and we thought hopefully that would continue to July. And unfortunately, at least for V-Trips and other people that have been posting on LinkedIn, a lot of property managers in the US market seem to be pretty disappointed in July. So we have an expert here, Melanie Brown from Key Data, and I was going to ask Melanie kind of what happened in July and how bad was it?
Yeah, I think you're not alone in that, Steve. July was not quite as rosy as well as the early parts of August, as I think a lot of us had hoped it would be. We saw just continuing lower occupancy rates than in 2023. So I've got Q3 data in front of me. We're at 7% lower than last year. So down from about 46% US occupancy last year to 43% this year. I'll go ahead and bring up booking windows. That's been a hot topic for a lot of people in the last couple of weeks. Kind of nationally, we've seen something a little differently than a lot of people are talking about, and even different than you and I have talked about, Steve. We saw fewer last-minute bookings this year than we did last year. Not by a huge amount, but enough that when we were looking at July and mid-June, July looked pretty stable. It was looking like summer was going to be pretty good. We saw fewer last-minute bookings, kind of a continued slightly shorter stay length, meaning that a lot of that occupancy we were expecting to appear did not. So I think, kind of further eroded the summer travel season as we moved through it in a way that none of us really expected. But interested to hear, I think, your perspective on last-minute bookings may be slightly different.
And I have to say, like I did last year, we missed, right? So we did some good things and then we did some not so good things. So the things we did well in June and July of 2024 versus June and July of 2023 is we went back to the basic of booking rules. And that increased our length of stay. It also kind of mitigated some of the ADR leakage. And in general, it made June really strong. What we did not so well and we need to fix is we weren't aggressive enough about pulling in bookings earlier in the year, in particular the first quarter. And so we really had this deficit. And the problem that we had is we had for the last 60 days going into July, which would be June 1st into July 31st, we had 50% of our inventory still available. And then we had a bunch of tropical storms. We had natural disasters. And so, as you can imagine, that impacted those bookings. So by not grabbing more of the bookings further in advance, it led us into a vulnerable position where these tropical storms and other things that affect people hurt us. And just to give you some perspective, in 2023, we booked 30% of July in the first quarter. In 2024, we only booked 18%. So what that meant is, we were holding back. We had these stricter booking rules. We assumed that competition was blowing inventory out, which they probably were. We were sticking to our guns, and it certainly helped us with the booking rules. But at the end, we had too much inventory that was available at the last minute. So in a nutshell, that's what happened to us. And we're going to try not to do that again. It's too dangerous, particularly going into June and July, where you potentially have tropical storms or even worse, hurricanes.
Or wildfires in a lot of the western part of the country and Canada as well. Weather is an increasingly tough factor for people to anticipate. I think a lot of other managers ended up in the same situation, Steve, from the data that I've seen and people we've talked to. There's a little bit of, it seems like, complacency around rates, where people got pretty optimistic and we were starting to see average daily rates creep back up again. So pacing like 5% ahead for the rest of the summer. I think people were really hoping to see that demand materialize. Like we said, June, July was looking pretty good. So I think people got a little complacent and maybe were not continuing to adjust rates downward or adjust their booking, kind of reservation strategies. And I think it caught a lot of people by surprise as we continue to see consumers a little more price sensitive.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn this over to Miriam. I'm gonna give you a couple more information points, and then Miriam can talk about her market, which I think unfortunately replicated most of the markets in the US. So good news, bad news. Our ADR did not collapse anywhere near as much as we had thought, but I think that's bad because we should have reduced ADR sooner in the first quarter, right? So I'm going to give you effectively the spread, which was ADR was down 5% in July. Not terrible, but then occupancy was down well over 10%, and we didn't think there was any way we wouldn't beat 2023 in July. So we left occupied nights on the table, and that's really where we think we missed. We should have started reducing rates sooner in the first quarter. This is hindsight, but the only way we can get better is by trying to figure out what we did right and wrong. Again, I will stand by that going with stricter booking rules was the right way because we eliminated getting stuck with, orphan nights and gap nights and all the other messes that you have. But Miriam, you were dealing with owners firsthand.
I agree and disagree on that. I mean, as we all know, right? I think we knew first quarter, about the ADR and the occupied nights. Where I feel we really dropped the ball is the larger stuff, the 4+ bedrooms in January, February, where we did not drop those rates. The nights, the orphan nights on those larger properties, for me and in my market, is different than the markets in the Panhandle, where you see that more. We have to do better. I think a lot of times we talk about other groups, but as Steve said, we dropped it the first quarter. Even after the first quarter, we still didn't adjust correctly. We still waited till June to really focus in on the 5 bedrooms and up, which really dropped our rates, and we had a lot of open nights that could have been filled had we done this correctly, even after the first quarter, even into the second quarter. And talking to homeowners, if you educate your homeowner right now, they realize the time that we're in. So they are good with a lower ADR than what they are at a higher one and letting it sit. And I think we're seeing that not only just in my market as a whole of, look, it's been a tough year. I mean, we had President Trump, tried to attempt assassination. We have the election coming up. We have the president dropping out of the race. Our VP now is going to be the electoral vote there. And so people are a little scared. They're more self-conscious of what they are spending. When you go to the grocery store, and I think it all ties in together with rates, with the nightly rental rate and everyday living. When you go to the grocery store, you buy bread, milk, coffee, and it's $50, $60. You have to take that into your occupied nights from also adding on fees. And I think we've struggled with that fee structure as well of having the occupied nights, the rent base, but then also bringing in another topic of that fee category. So you're seeing that both of a flex. Look, I think larger properties we definitely missed, and I don't think it was just a V-Trips issue. I think everyone in the markets really did not justify the big election coming up, the cost of living inflated, and looking at the end of the year, I think everybody hold on to your hat because it's going to be tough.
Yeah, good to go ahead and start looking at Thanksgiving and Christmas rates for those large properties where you're hoping for large extended families to come into your market.
And here's the thing: if we've not already done that, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, you're way behind the ball for sure. But I mean, we're talking to people. Just a short booking window gives your business so much volatility.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people don't book in those last 2 weeks, your units are going to stay open. So even I go back to this example all the time, but in early 2023, when we were really starting to feel a little bit of shift in the industry, everybody was worried about Florida spring break and what was happening. And the one clear indicator I found across all of these markets was the markets with long booking windows were set. Their occupancy pacing was great. The market with those shorter booking windows were the ones struggling year over year because you have these travelers who may be in a lower price range, who may be feeling, the economic, the family's financial situation a little bit more. Those are the ones who are not going to book at the last minute. And like we've said, like if your pricing strategy is not dialed in 60, 90 days out, those people may just not book, right? You've lost to them. So we continue to talk to property managers. Doesn't matter your market, your inventory type, whether you're high end or low end, really encouraging that longer booking window, kind of adjusting prices downwards 6 months out instead of 2 weeks out. It's going to be the key for feeling a little more secure and stable as the market continues to shift.
What are your thoughts on, and I'm really, after speaking to a few homeowners, I really think getting pricing correct for next summer now and going and getting some reservations on the books is going to be key. I know that we're a year out and some of those properties will start booking, but I think it's really key from where, as a whole, we've all missed this opportunity of getting that dialed in for next year now.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason not to try, right? I don't think between now and January you'll pick up so much occupancy that you will have left a ton of money on the table, right? If you set rates a little too low now, you can always adjust as occupancy pickup continues to come through for next summer. What you don't want to do is miss out on the 15, 20, 25% of guests who are looking for next summer for their family vacations because you're priced 25% too high.
And I think that's where we've dropped the ball in the past. Or I mean, and look, I'm not all in the revenue. I've worked with it some and just being in this, but I think honestly, gapping it so much ahead a year out is definitely a key factor in it. I think times are definitely changing. I think the more booking out is going to be good, but we're not going to get that 20-25% increase. I think we need to really price it where it really needs to be now, get that flow in, and then adjust closer.
And that's where all your reservation rules really come into play as well, right? Is you can have a longer minimum stay length when you're booking 12 months in advance. You can have a more strict cancellation policy when you're booking 12 months in advance, or less strict, right? It really depends on the market and what your guests are looking for. And then you can start to adjust those rules as we get closer to the stay date. But why not try to go ahead and book those week or 2 week long stays for next summer at this point?
No, I completely agree. And I think after the summer and some of the year that some of the homeowners have had, going ahead and getting that pushed on the books for next year is a win on both sides.
Yeah.
So Melanie, one of the things I think we're discussing now is what's occurring with the school break calendars, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. Because of all the e-learning loss over the last couple of years, the schools have reduced the summer break. And that may be part of why July was weaker, because in some cases schools were starting the first week of August, the second week of August. And then if you have training or athletic or, band practice or things like that, they're starting a couple weeks prior. The other thing that happens is they're then creating breaks in the fall, breaks in the winter, breaks in the spring, extra breaks. So are you seeing that in your data, this shift created by this compression of the K through 12 school calendar?
Not really. I would say kind of nationally, the summer travel season is about the same length it's always been. It's still kind of early to mid-June through mid-August. We did see the travel season start maybe a week later this summer than we did last year. July was definitely lower year over year. I think a lot of it, we're still seeing strong shoulder seasons compared to what we had pre-pandemic in a lot of markets. So things, yeah, I mean, the schedule's continuing to adjust, but there's nothing in the data that's really, that seems to be really strongly correlated to changing school schedules. I think it's always so variable by state as to when kids are going back to school. So I grew up in North Carolina when you didn't go back to school until basically early September. And so the Outer Banks have this very long summer travel season. So I think the question is, as usual, it kind of depends.
So that's a fun thing that you're saying that. So when I was in school, which is 20 years, whatever, we went back the end of August, 1st of September. The kids now were back in school the last week of July here. And so it's almost a month difference from when I went back to school to where it is now. And in the past 5 years, it's already been pushed up forward 2 weeks. So it's definitely going in. And like you said, if you're looking at mid-June as really the first start of pickup, 5-6 years ago, we were Labor Day. So we were two weeks ahead. So it does play a factor of when schools are letting in and out, because it does, you just said we do have that 2 week gap where before it was Memorial Day weekend here and forward. Now we're mid-June before we're hitting a season.
Right, 100%. So, on a year-over-year basis, not that different. But if we went back and compared to 2018, then maybe we would see some of the shift.
So Melanie, were there any bright spots in the U.S. market for July, or was it all pretty much doom and gloom?
There's always some bright spots. I think July 4th was a strong travel week. That is the 1 week out of July when kind of revenue matched 2023. So we continue to see strong demand around big events. We actually, on a national basis, are seeing, the larger properties do a little better. Again, totally destination dependent. But I think, there's still large families, large groups of friends out there looking for the large homes to go spend a week or a long weekend in as a group. So yeah, I would say those were the bright spots. July 4th was super successful. And then we did start to see some rate moderation as well. So prices starting to come kind of even to last year. Again, does that hurt occupancy? Remains to be seen. Again, dependent on the destination and inventory type. But there were some bright spots in July. We did not see the bottom fall out. And I think if that had happened in July, a lot of people would be in a really hard situation with their annual revenue figures.
So let's talk about Europe. As I've been tracking Europe, now I haven't seen the latest numbers, but Europe was doing considerably better than the United States market. Is that still the case?
Yes, but we've seen performance start to slow in Europe a little bit too. We're getting closer. So looking at summer kind of revenue pacing for our property managers we work with in Europe, it's flat year over year at this point. So flat is better than the US, which is down 4 to 5%, not as good as we were seeing in Europe a little while ago. Europe has had some big events. And a lot of protest as well. So I think the European travel scene is now more complicated than it was 6 weeks ago. Paris, for example, hugely successful on a macro level. On a per property basis, though, revenues were pretty flat compared to the prior year. So you had so much inventory increase, so many new listings for Paris short-term rentals, that the average property didn't pick up any occupancy from that event. And I know reports I read as the Olympics were starting, so maybe this has changed a little bit. Inbound international tourism to Paris was not quite as high as people had hoped it would be. And then, in Barcelona, there's been a lot of protests, so I think changing travel patterns there. And then even a report from Skift this morning talked about how Americans are not planning to travel to Europe as much as they did kind of in 2023 as we look towards the Labor Day holiday. So European travel is now, more expensive than it was 12 months ago. Americans are feeling that pinch in their wallets a little bit more. And so European travel will slow down a little bit.
Yeah, so it seems to me like some of the reports coming in from Europe, Southeast Asia, obviously we talked about the US market, is that consumer credit, a lot of consumers are tapped out. Their credit cards are maxed out. In addition, one of the things that I think is a little concerning, more than a little concerning, is the state of the Chinese economy. And the reason why the Chinese economy is a factor on travel is because somewhere starting in 10 years ago, the Chinese started to travel internationally in significant numbers, and that had a big impact on Europe and to a lesser extent on the US market. But second, the Chinese economy is in probably a depression, and that's affecting the other Asian countries surrounding China, which would be Korea, Japan, Singapore, etc. So, that certainly has created a concern that there could be a global slowdown. So I do think there are certainly some numbers that would suggest we may have peaked in some of the travel to Europe. Certainly from a domestic standpoint, assuming the US market kind of starts to head towards a slowdown, which there have been some economic reports suggesting we may be slowing down, it's not out of the question that people may travel less internationally. There's a reason why people travel domestically. It's cheaper. It's also cheaper in general to get into a vacation rental and just drive to it. So I know there was a lot of pent-up demand to travel to Europe because of COVID. I'm not so certain that we're going to see as much outbound US travel to Europe next year. Have you heard any of this information, or is it just too early to tell for 2025 or beyond?
I haven't really seen estimates past the next quarter or so. From what I've seen for the rest of the year, yes, American travel internationally is slowing. It's more expensive. For a while, it was really cheap to hop on a flight over to Europe. And now the cost of a European vacation has grown faster than the cost of staying put in the US. I do think we probably saw a lot of pent-up demand for international travel for Americans. It came out at a really good time with a really strong US dollar. and some cheap flights. And I do think that's going to slow. You know, what I haven't heard is that it's going to stop, right? It'll just kind of get back to that pre-pandemic norm, which is it's good
Well,
for domestic short-term rentals.
yeah, I think that's what US property managers are hoping for, is to get back to pre-pandemic levels of domestic travel. I do think, unfortunately, it's going to be hard for us to get to the US market, the international travel. The currency rates are really imbalanced. It's just really expensive for travelers from the UK, Canada, to come to the US right now, given how weak the pound is and how weak the Canadian dollars. And those were two of our bigger markets. South America, for the most part, they've had currency devaluations, or in the case of some of the countries like Argentina, they're in economic distress. Brazil, also another one that was a feeder market for the US. So, you know, I don't know that there's an easy answer where we're going to all of a sudden get a flurry of international travelers to the US. I do think there may be a point in 2025 where less of our domestic travelers are going internationally. They could stay in the US. That certainly would help the domestic vacation rental industry. So I wanted to ask, before we just continue to talk about July, how does the fall look? I mean, is there any optimism with the fall, or is it still more the same?
Right now the fall looks pretty flat to last year in the US, which could be optimistic. It really depends on the month and the week. So Q4 overall occupancy rate is exactly what it was last year. Rates up a couple of percent. So ADR up 2% for Q4, which means revenue is up 2% for Q4. What we have continued to see, though, is that same situation we had in July, where in early June, July looked like it was going to be great. And then things shifted as we moved through that booking period in July, and it got a little slow. And so I feel quite a bit of uncertainty about the fall and the end of the year, to be honest with you. Say ideal situation is we're flat to last year. Probably realistic scenario is occupancy is a couple percentage points lower than in 2023 for the rest of the year.
Looking at our numbers, August, November, and December look good. October, we're running behind, although, you know, those are Miriam's markets for Leafs and our Deep Creek location. Miriam, is it an issue that people are waiting to see if the leaves actually turn colors before they start to book vacations?
It's nervous looking at our calendars. I will definitely say that. What we really see here is the last two and a half weeks of October, and really the first week into November has in the past been peak leaf time. Look, I'm here. That's really whenever it's the best here. I will say a lot of folks are nervous. And I will say, looking at our calendars, I'm nervous. Again, I think we have missed it on the large properties price-wise. And I don't think, again, that's not just an us issue. That's a lot of people that I talk to in the area that have done this for years. I mean, look, we have 4-bedroom properties that have nothing the entire month of October and into November that sleep 18 to 20 people. We should have some traction. If we don't have traction now, which I'm looking at that we don't, it's really going to be hard to put people in those properties at a decent rate, because we've already missed the mark on some of that. If we look at the trends that we've seen for June and July, we've sat here and talked about. Look, I may be completely wrong, and I hope that I am, and these calendars may fill up. But if you're looking at the trends that we were talking about on making sure pricing is right and the occupied nights, it's going to be a tough October for the Smoky Mountains.
Miriam, what levels are you going to pull 6-8 weeks out to try to get some occupancy pickup between now and the fall season? What levers are you going to pull? Are you just going to drop prices?
We're going to have to do both. So
Yeah.
we're gonna have to look at, make sure the occupied nights of how the stay is out and dropping rates.
Yeah, I mean, what Miriam's saying is correct. In the leaf season, when I used to do revenue management, it was actually the inverse of the summer. The smaller properties outpace the larger properties because the target market during leaf season tends to be more couples and certainly smaller groups. It's not, a 5-bedroom or 6-bedroom property is tougher to rent than in the summer or Thanksgiving or Christmas. So you've got to really play with pricing. I used to, boost the 1-bedrooms up and really bring the larger properties down. So it's the inverse of what typical season is for those large level.
If you look at our grid, you can see our smaller stuff is booked up, but did we leave money on the table and price it too low? Because if you're looking at our grids right now, the 1 and 2 bedrooms realistically should have some availability, out, or is the ADR good? I haven't really started flipping through. I definitely will. But like Steve's saying, our 1 and 2, 3 bedrooms should be booking closer because we've kept that rate higher, where the larger stuff we should have already had booked out.
Well, we've kind of seen this on a national level too, is like the erosion of the middle class, not just at a macroeconomic level, but when you look at these properties, we have seen at times, we've seen the large properties do pretty well, and the small properties do pretty well, both from bedrooms and then also rate tiers. Like lower end properties are actually doing okay in a lot of markets. High end properties are doing okay. It's that middle that's kind of disappeared. And so maybe these families that would normally book a 4-bedroom property are saying, hey, we've got to save some money. We can squeeze into a 2 or 3-bedroom place. We're kind of the middle rate tier properties. People are saying we can still travel. We just got to spend $150 less per night than we usually do. So they're booking the more budget friendly properties. And then on the upper end of things, like the large groups are still booking large homes, and the people with money are still traveling. So it seems like maybe you're feeling and seeing that a little bit too, Miriam, when you're looking at the fall, is maybe people are downsizing.
I mean, well, yes and no. I mean, you can't downsize a property that sleeps 18 to a property that sleeps 8.
No, definitely not, right? You could take like one little step down, but not all the way.
You can go from a 14 to a 10. We could probably justify that. No, I think it's more, it's across the board. And like you initially said, you're seeing it across the globe where 1 and 2 trend, the larger trend, it's that middle and that medium. But again, it's justifying and getting the correct rate on the seasonality of, I call it the newlyweds and the nearly deads, is what we get in the October, November, and then also here in January, February. So if you don't have those larger items booked out, it's definitely a struggle.
Right, because they're not tied to the school seasons.
Correct.
Well, I'd like to talk more about this, but we have another subject to talk about, which is a fun topic. Everyone loves it. It's called the OTA share shift. So, Melanie, I know we've talked for a while that Verbo was deteriorating. I think I saw something from Key Data that in July it seemed like Verbo had rebounded. Is that correct? Have we seen the end of the deterioration? Is there hope that Verbo can claw back some of its market share losses?
Verbo's decline has slowed a little bit in the US. Airbnb continues to charge. Booking, although a small share of overall reservations, continuing to grow. So I'm kind of struggling, I think, at this point to fully get a finger on what's happening with Verbo. I would say they're still declining, and they're certainly not gaining share back.
Well, let's talk about the numbers. So in the book that you published on June 9th, you showed Airbnb as a percentage of revenue at 23% in 2022, and now up to 27% in 2027 and 2024, and Verbo moving from 30% in 2022 down to 25% in 2024. So some pretty dramatic swings, and in Europe it's even more brutal. If we look at Verbo decline, although they claim they kind of stopped advertising in Europe, but Miriam, I think you've kind of had your finger on the pulse of Verbo. One of the things that happened, Melanie, is policy changes at Verbo. They sprung these policy changes on us somewhere in late 2023. One of the bigger policy changes was that in order to retain Premier Partnership, your cancellation rate had to be 1%. You could only have 1% cancellation, which was a huge swing from 5%. So it went from 5% to 1%. The problem was, as we kind of investigated the policy, they said, well, if it's a traveler initiated cancellation, it doesn't count against you. And if it's a weather related cancellation, it doesn't count against you. But apparently the software that property managers use didn't easily correlate. And in some cases, people that you have as employees didn't even realize that you had to code all this stuff properly. So V-Trips lost 80% of our properties, got removed out of Premier Partnership by the first quarter. And it took us raising hell. I mean, with Verbo, and we partly thank you at Key Data, because Jason Sprinkle went on a keynote at VRMA and said, hey, it's not us, it's you, VRBO. You're losing ground here. And then VRBO, and then there was an earning call at Expedia where they blamed Verbo for pulling the entire company down on a missed earning. So all of a sudden now Verbo was much more engaged with property managers to figure out how to get them back to Premier Partnership, because Airbnb was eating their lunch. So have you heard anything about this? Because I mean, it was a fiasco. We got everything back to Premier Partnership, but man, we lost probably 6 months in some of our markets.
Yeah, and on top of that, I know there were so many issues, just integration issues where, property details got changed and big amenities, disappeared and were no longer coded correctly. So there's been a lot of problems with Verbo. They even said, or the CEO said in the Q2 earnings report that just came out, they admitted to really cutting back on marketing spend. They seem to accept a lot of responsibility, which is good, and are hoping to start spending more money to turn things around. So Verbo seems to know what's going on, right, at a company level. I think it remains to be seen how much of that share they can claw back. And then, even just kind of sentiment around property managers. Steve, in 2019, everybody hated Airbnb, right? Nobody wanted to list on Airbnb. Even in 2021, people still didn't like listing on Airbnb. And in the last year, I'm not hearing as negative stuff about Airbnb anymore from managers. It's coming, it's pointed at Verbo now. And so I think those strategies to continue to retain the professionals and keep your inventory on those platforms is going to be really important for both of these companies over the next couple of years.
Miriam, what have you heard about Verbo? Because I mean, they were such a huge portion of Gatlinburg OTA distribution. I mean, and this channel literally deteriorated over 2 years.
I think they didn't keep up with the times. I've said it once and I will continuously saying it. I think Airbnb stepped on the platform. They kept hosting, the bigger clientele. If you look at it, I'm going to use it from Paris. You have a ton of A-list celebrities. I'll use Steph Curry. Him and his family stayed at an Airbnb. They are pushing Airbnb. All social media right now is pushing that. Look, VRBO had their downfalls. They definitely screwed up on, changing formats, changing cancellation, changing different things, not implementing it or telling property managers different things. Look, we all dropped the ball. We should have done our research, but definitely from them being the supplier screwed up. but also changing the times. If you look at my market, most people who are coming are the younger generation, are booking on Airbnb. VRBO has to do a much better job of getting out there and being ahead and being in the times. Look, I'm a huge advocate for VRBO. I started in property management using their software, really being strictly on their platforms. So I would love to see them change the game and get back to where they need to be, because I think they can. I think it's getting ahead of it and getting to 2024, 2025 instead of being back in 1999. I think that's their biggest gap and downfall right now.
A couple things to add is number one, Verbo's app is really hard to use. I am one of those, I know, look, I'm one of those
I'm not this.
Right, I'm one of those child-free couples trying to book my leaf peeping vacation in the Colorado mountains for a pet-friendly rental. And I generally look at the OTAs as like a search engine and then book with the property manager, right? I'm not going to sit here and say I only book on the OTAs. That would be bad. But it's nice to have everything in one spot. But even looking for a dog-friendly rental, if I had the pet-friendly option checked and changed my date of stay by a day or changed it from a condo to a house, that pet-friendly option was no longer checked. And suddenly I started seeing all of these options that no longer met some of my core criteria that I want to take my dog on vacation with me. And so Airbnb continues to win the app game in terms of usability. And I think that is a big thing, especially, right? I'm the young millennial traveler who is booking through an app and trying to figure out what's going on. And the usability is just so different across those platforms. So that's my first point. The second one is Verbo has traditionally been stronger in the large groups, large properties, long stay lane. Airbnb, though, if you read their quarterly earnings reports, has started for the last couple of quarters, has started really focusing on better experiences for groups, kind of pushing for longer stays in some situations. And now they're focused on the non-urban, more leisure beach mountain ski markets as well. So Verbo's really got to be careful in all of those areas to retain that. You're going to get the extended family for a week-long stay at the beach because Airbnb is coming for them.
You said the key words there. They seen what was happening, and so they changed. Right? Airbnb saw the data. They repositioned and went at this. That's definitely what VRBO has to do. And look, maybe they're doing it, and we're just not seeing it yet. I hope to God they are. Again, strong VRBO. But I think you said it. You have to change and go with what is happening in the trends.
This is such a fascinating conversation, and there's some people like me and others that have been in the industry long enough to remember when Verbo was new, Airbnb was a spec, and then obviously anyone that started to spend time in Europe understanding how powerful Booking.com is and continues to be. And so what I think is interesting is in Europe, it's a completely different story between Booking.com and Airbnb. Booking.com actually is gaining ground with property managers against Airbnb. What's fascinating is that Booking.com, which now has a market cap of $120 billion, and has far surpassed Airbnb, who has dropped down to about 70 billion, which is still far greater than Expedia, is that Booking.com was able to recapture those property managers. But what's also interesting is that Booking.com was able to somehow rebrand themselves. I mean, they're a company that's close to 20 years old, and yet the younger generation likes Booking.com in some cases much more than Airbnb. And they have spent a huge amount of money on places like TikTok, where the younger generation is staying. Now, I'm talking about Booking.com. So it's not that it's impossible as a large OTA to kind of pivot and get out of this, hey, we're a mature company, our customer base is literally dying. And Booking.com did it, and they've done it in a way where they've done both. They've been supplier friendly, more supplier friendly than Airbnb, and they've also seemingly been able to recapture that youth generation gap. And this data is upheld by places like Appfolio that show the number of downloads of Booking.com versus Airbnb. I think Booking.com had 80 million downloads worldwide. Airbnb was down to 50 million for the app worldwide. That's one. The second thing is in the US market, Expedia bought Verbo, not saying any news there, but they've never been able to integrate Verbo into Expedia and to gain that kind of marketing, because I think everybody would agree at this point, it's kind of difficult to be marketing two different brands. You have to spend marketing on Verbo, then you have to spend money and marketing on Expedia. And we were told they were going to integrate these things into one platform, and they really haven't effectively done it. So this is kind of the problem with Verbo and Expedia, is they just haven't executed. And then you've got Airbnb in North America, who badly needs more revenue. Anybody can go look at the second quarter results to hear what happened there. And the reason why their stock is off 35% in valuation is because a lot of people think Airbnb is starting to slow down in revenue. Well, guess where they think they have the best opportunity to gain revenue? It's the US market. And so I don't know how Verbo / Expedia get their way out of this, because the only way you could do it would be improve your app, which Melanie said, spend money on marketing, start to advertise a ton on TikTok and other new media forms. And then third, be more supplier friendly. And these self-inflicted wounds that happen with these configuration and technical problems that Melanie alluded to, I mean, they should not be happening. I mean, I don't understand how a company that used to have just really strong client success teams allowed this to happen. But I mean, it certainly doesn't look good for Expedia / Verbo right now, because they've got two companies, Booking.com and Airbnb, in their space, who just have so much more capital right now to outspend and out execute them. And their app is old and outdated and appeals to an old and outdated customer base. It's not a good situation.
It's also interesting looking at stock prices. I mean, in the last 30 days, Airbnb's down 19.5%. Expedia's down 1/3%. And so the investment community views those two companies way differently than we in the short-term rental industry do, right? Because Expedia is diversified outside of just Verbo. And so it'll be kind of interesting to see the general direction of this corporation in the next couple of years, and which direction they choose to take Verbo in.
Well, Expedia is trading at a market cap of 17 billion. You're right, it's been flat. It's down from its highs. And if you look at kind of the historical chart, it's pretty much traded flat for the last couple of years, which is not good.
Right. Not a growth company by any means right now.
If you compare it to Booking.com, there's not one person on this call who wouldn't want to have it invested in Booking.com, because it's probably been the most successful stock in the travel industry. But I think the bigger issue with Expedia / Verbo is if they can't pull off the integration, why wouldn't they spin it out, right? I mean, it just seems like this is a poor fit, that Expedia is causing Verbo to be weighed down, right? I mean, I actually think Verbo has more value than it's showing, but it's because it's tied up in all this Expedia mess. They were so much better when they were free, right? Before the Expedia transition, HomeAway / Verbo was just fundamentally a better company. So I'm not sure what's going to happen, but it is a bad fit right now between Expedia and Verbo. Expedia is not helping Verbo, and they haven't been able to pull off the integration, which is just bizarre. I can't understand 8 years later how this vacation rental inventory isn't seamlessly integrated into Expedia. You have to use a channel manager. It's just bizarre. And I was struck by your slides, Melanie. You don't even break out Expedia on your your US market slides. That's how bad it is.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like 0.1% maybe of all US reservations. So it's really not worth breaking out, unfortunately. Um, the other thing, so Jason and I just did a big webinar on OTA share, and we looked at a lot of Google search data and how that's trended over the last 5 years. And that was really interesting to me as well. Is Airbnb is a household name, right? It's people will say Tupperware and Kleenex instead of tissue. And so people don't search for short-term rentals. They don't search for vacation rentals. They search for Airbnb. So, I guess that's one tip for property managers is they continue to diversify their listings. Like make sure you're picking up on that search keyword on your direct booking website somehow as well. Unfortunately, at some point you just got to lean into that connotation as much as we all hate it. So Airbnb has that household name. I think it'll be hard for any of the other platforms to take that back. Not necessarily impossible. And then when looking at European search data, Booking.com barely showed up, which is wild because Steve, as you said, it's like 45% of all of our reservations in Europe come through Booking.com. As it turns out, people go directly to Booking.com. They don't Google Paris Booking.com short-term rentals. They just go straight to Booking, and all of their quarterly earnings back that up. With their direct traffic is really high and much higher than any of the other OTAs.
Yeah. So in the time that's left, which we're getting close to the end, are there any up and coming OTAs that you want to flag? I did want to say that Homes to Go, although not a huge piece, has been decent. I mean, not terrible for V-Trips. We use StaySense, which is mostly in the Gatlinburg area. They kind of used to be called Smoky Mountain.com and rebranded. We tried Google Vacations. It's terrible right now. Is there any channel? I saw that Capital One is entering the market. Amex is entering the market. Marriott Homes and Villas just made news that they're partnering with Sonder, which is one of the more bizarre press releases I've seen recently, because Sonder can't even put out quarterly earnings, and they're a publicly traded company, and they have a real cash problem. But anything that people should be looking at?
I think Whimstay is the other one that comes to mind to kind of capture those last minute bookings. I know a lot of our managers have been pretty successful using that. I mean, I think, look, it's all diversification right now. Is how do you get more eyes on your properties in a very crowded market due to supply increase? And I keep picturing this is like Swiss cheese, and so every OTA has some holes. But you put 5 slices together and you've got a pretty solid calendar for the rest of the year. So as long as you're not spending more time and resources than this OTA is worth, right? You've got to evaluate the cost of managing all of those integrations. Why not diversify your listings across a bunch of different sites? But Whimstay, to your point, Steve, is the other one that I think people should take a look at.
All right, Miriam, any pearls of wisdom from you to make people optimistic about 2025, or things they can do to help themselves? Because I've kind of got depressed listening to some of your comments.
Oh, well, don't be depressed. No, I think it's getting pricing correct. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing is as a whole, getting pricing correct initially is going to be key. And don't be depressed. I mean, it is what it is. I think it's a learning. Like, I think 2024 has been the year of learning for everyone. I don't think anyone has nailed it. I think everybody has taken a lot this year, and it'll be the strong who make it. And I think, again, going back to getting pricing correct for the peak times at least 8 months in advance is going to be key moving forward, not just for 2024, but 25 and on.
All right. Well, Miriam gets the last word, as always. Thank you both, Melanie, Miriam, Heather, for another great episode of Straight Fire VR. If you want to look at other episodes, go to our website, straightfirevr.com. Thank you again. For another great episode of Straightfire VR. If you want to look at other episodes, go to our website, straightfirevr.com. Thank you again. For another great episode of Straightfire VR. If you want to look at other episodes, go to our website.